Hi, everyone. I'm BJ. I'm a genealogist and a librarian here in Maine. And tonight I'm going to do the final part of our series on immigration and naturalization. And so tonight's topic is, what if you have naturalization papers, immigration passenger list, and you don't get anything more than Ireland or Poland or Ukraine? So I'm going to talk about places you might want to look to see where somebody came, or maybe you just don't have anything because they came before there was paperwork. Yeah, Irish famine immigrants. This is often an issue. Um, my examples, I focused in Scotland and Ireland because that's where my research has been, and that's where the organization I first developed this for was Scotland. It was the Scottish Indexes Conference. So, but like with other things, this is to give you an idea of what's out there, what kinds of records to look for, and go from there. So let me share my screen. Get other stuff up so I can see it. And so there's you know, a lot of problem. We are told our ancestors came from such and such a place, and it's a county in Ireland, or we were you Volga German, um, which was German speakers further east, and things like that. Um, and for the most part, anywhere you go in Europe, you're going to need something more than a province or a county or a region. And so this is looking at, where might you find more details? Where might somebody have, writing things down, been more interested than just County Limerick or the um, what's now Lithuania? So let's walk through some of these. There's going to be a little duplication in this from other stuff, but I think you'll understand why as we go through. So, colonial era, this is essentially, even though the US is no longer a colony, going up to 1820, whereas you remember that's when there was first the requirement for passenger lists. There were few records, fewer survive, but because of social prestige and such, you get reconstructed lists. For example, the list of Mayflower passengers is from either Bradford or Brewster. I'm blanking out at the moment. Later writings, so 30 years later, it's not an actual passenger list. So that's something to keep in mind on early stuff. Um, so it's going to be a bit tough if you're looking before 1820. So in 1820, as I said, you begin to get passenger list required. They don't have information. So for those of us with ancestors from places like Ireland and Scotland, where finding Patrick Murphy or William Patterson means you're actually finding 147 men of the same name, 32 of whom migrated to the US within a 15-year period. It can be tough. By the 1890s, you get a Bureau of Immigration, 1906, federal government takes over naturalization, and after that you begin to get standardized documents. So that's the situation we're in. Um, Again, 1922, a woman's citizenship is separated from that of her husband, which means that before 1922, you often don't get women being naturalized separately. And 1924, you get a quota system, and so there are more records, and plus there's also much more family memory if people came after 1924. And as I showed you other times, you get a naturalization paperwork, um, where you have where they were born, is on here somewhere. Yeah, but again, often, Minsk in this case is both a city and a province, and it's a big enough city. Lewis may actually have been from a nearby town and says Minsk the way somebody living in the Boston suburbs will say Boston, or someone who lives in the town of Cumberland, Maine, says they live in Portland when they're talking to somebody from Massachusetts or California. So one of the things to check on this, though, is if this isn't clear, we'll check the first couple children. And in this case, they're born in the US. But I have seen cases where there's a county or province up here for the parent, and then a townland in Ireland or a village in Poland down here in for the children's birthplaces. So that's something to be aware of. Again, on passenger lists, you get who they're going to, and on the second page, so you get often this will have um, where they're going, and it gives you another name to look and see if whether or father passenger list that has more detail. Um, and again, you can see here in 1905, just says Russia. That's not very helpful. And the sun just says US. So, but you want to look at the people around them and see if there are other people from the same place. And often, if the husband and wife have a different birthplace, say Russia, and let's say this Romanian woman was with the Russian, that may well indicate they met and married in the US, which may have records that give more details. Um, this is passenger list, and these are the nearest relatives still in the old country. And so this gives you um, where somebody is from. And so you have this is Samar, Strada, you are Romania, and you get Yarmouth, Great Yarmouth in the UK. Here's the Ministry of Communication in Peking, Beijing, and so on. So make sure you read through, and this is why it's worth looking, especially if it's somebody's second or third time coming into the US, seeing where they came from. And you'll notice here, this person who is Slovenian from Czechoslovakia actually lists somebody in London as where they're coming from. It's their last permanent residence. So this would tell you that there may be records in England of this person that you'd want to find as well. So the best places to look, you've got military records, Social Security, obituaries and other newspapers, town and county histories, church histories and records, and alien registrations. You knew I was going to come back to those eventually, right? So, military records. This is my grandfather. You'll notice it says Edinburgh as his birthplace. He was actually born in what was then a separate city, and by the time this was filled out, was part of Edinburgh. He was actually born in Leith. Um, this gets you close enough that with the exact birth date, you'd be able to find his birth record. This is an Edwin Reed. He's a baker. You'll notice it says Garlogie, Scotland. So it specifically says town, state, and nation. So they're treating this as essentially a US address of the town, skipping the county level, Scotland, UK. So that's a World War One draft registration. So this is this form is the one that gets you the best answer usually. They had multiple forms over the course of World War One, but this one specifically says town. And so I found that you're most likely to get. But you'll notice this also says he had been a soldier in the UK. So right there, if this didn't have this, that would be something to take and try to find his UK record for the military and see if it gives a better, more local place. So here's an interesting one. This is World War One. We've got Poland and Germany. So what on earth does that mean? And it's hard to tell because it may mean he's a native German speaker who is from Poland. It may be that he's a native Polish speaker from Germany, what's now Germany, was Germany at this in 1918. Or it may be he's from one of the places that was in both of these places at some point. But if we look here, the actual one, it says Strasbourg, Poland, Germany. Well, this tells us it's not the Strasbourg on the French-German border. There must be another town with that name on the Eastern Front, as well as the Western Front of Germany. Does that make sense? Why I pulled this one to show you? Because you end up with that same thing of some, you know, if you just say Springfield, USA, or Manchester, USA, you may have 45 or 50 places to choose from. Actually, in the Philadelphia area, there are like three different towns and three counties named Springfield. And so they always say Springfield, Elko for Delaware County for that one. Now, this tells you he's naturalized. So there may be paperwork for that that gives you more of an idea of what this place actually is. And when you start getting people in smaller towns, you want to look at who else in that neighborhood. This is World War One, so this is like 1918. You'd probably want to look at the 1910 and 1920 censuses and see who else is giving any part of this as their place of origin, especially people who live near Stanley and his family, because you might well find that I came in a clump. I would probably see if I could find passenger lists for his wife and mother if they didn't come over with him, because that might be more detail. So now here's one. We have Joseph, I think it's Puzo. And you see he's living in Lynn, Massachusetts. You have a birth date in 1887, still not naturalized, works for himself, and not quite sure what this says, but it's somewhere in Italy. But if we go and look further, here we have Vincenzo Puzo living at the same address and giving Prezzi something Italy. Um, but I'm guessing that if you look at these two, I'm guessing these are brothers or cousins because they're living at the same address, the same last name. And these are a few years apart. Um, but I would say that, you want to look for both of these people and for both of these towns and seeing if you can find a town with this name or close to it near a town with this name. And you may have a case here where, you have, you know, separate little villages within a parish. And that's what happened is, and the family moved 300 yards, but um, went to the same church type of thing. So, but this is one reason it's worth tracking siblings. This is not Rossi or one of the other really common Italian names. That may be common in that little part of Italy, but of the people who immigrated to the US, there aren't a whole lot of them. So I would certainly, since they're at the same, 38 and a half Pleasant Street, that's pretty specific. So I would work on both of these for figuring out a place they were from. Oops, wrong way. Now here's one. We have a Moisha Monjean from Quebec, which isn't a huge bit of help. But again, if we find the actual one, instead of just having Quebec, comma, France, what you see here is um, this, I think it's Shotsville, Quebec, and then he's a native speaker of French. And so whoever took this down, this is not the country of France. He's a native French speaker. Um, and this is the place name. Does that make sense to everybody? That, you've heard me say it, and I think most of you know this enough. You don't stand up because you get cases like this where there's another detail in the index. And even if I wasn't sure whether they meant France here or not, it does say he's a Canadian citizen. Um, Here's another one. This one does say France, but he's an Italian subject. And so I'm guessing he's from a little town near Marseille where the border was a little fuzzy. Does that make sense? I would be really careful here to make sure I don't stick to just Marseille. Um, and again, this is one where I'd look at the other people who, are there other people in, and this is in Portland, Maine, at this time who say they're an Italian subject, but were born in France. Because again, you may find a cluster. Here's one in Oxford County, Maine. Um, and USA South Paris is an interesting. And this is one where it turns out he is a natural born citizen born in South Paris, USA, here in Maine. So, you know, just because he's stuck in here with these other French ones doesn't mean that the Paris means he's not born in the US. Does it make sense why it's worth going through? Because if you looked at that, you'd go, South Paris, USA, where could that be? And then you look down here and it says South Paris, Maine, and you're like, Um, now, turning to Social Security, which I'm guessing most of you know, started in the 1930s. And so there was a um, and so there was a huge push to get the enrollment from everybody. And so here you have this one in the middle is my grandfather. You'll notice in this one he does say Leith as his birthplace. He died, so this is a death claim. And this date is about a month and a half before, 2 months before my grandmother died. So I'm guessing that's why the name was updated, that they were doing something with her records because it's 30 years after he died. But if we look here, Lonehead, like Leith, is now a part of Edinburgh. But you see, it gave his parents and the full name. And I'm guessing this is either his death or his widow's death um, update. And then the one here on the right, Innerleithen is its own town still. But you'll notice here, we've got her father's names for her with her mother's name as well. So these are very helpful. Here's a case. This is my grandmother, born in Scotland, but she was naturalized. And so if I didn't know where she was born, I would want to find that naturalization, which is post most of the indexes and most of the naturalizations online peter out because a lot of the work on them was done by WPA projects in the 30s. And so by the 40s, between that and privacy reasons, you're not getting them indexed as much. Does that make sense? Why, in this case, if I hadn't known where she was born, I'd want to track this down. Here's an obituary of a couple greats aunt, Mrs. Thomas Burt, um, birth name Jemima Patterson, gives birth date and place, parents, when they immigrated, when she married. Um, and so let's say Edinburgh turns out to be one of those, say Boston because you live in Eastern Massachusetts. This at least gives you some clues to find more detail, including maybe looking at the marriage record to say, because that may have the information. And then again, it does list um, family members here. What's interesting is um, they don't mention the children the siblings who predeceased her. And so that's one thing you want to remember is in this case, I know my great grandmother had predeceased her, and at one infant death, and a brother named James Jameson had, or James Potters, you know, had died as well. But yeah, here you see that very nicely gives you more to go on. Here's um, about a wedding anniversary, and it says, you know, they were where they were married. Um, a lot of Catholic churches, when somebody was married at a Catholic church, had to tell the church where they were baptized. And so it would be worth digging around and seeing which Catholic church they were married at in New Jersey to see if there's a place where they came from. And then when one of the daughters from this marriage dies, um, sorry, when the wife in this marriage dies, it mentions down here she still has a sister in Poland. And it also says that there's a brother in Schenectady. And because of societal stuff, Stephen Kaminsky may have left more records than Anna Kaminska Krajewska. Does that make sense? Why? You know, because he may well have, you know, military records and such that she didn't generate that would have the birthplaces. So if I were looking at this family, I would try to pursue both of these. And as you see here, we have two draft registration cards for Stephen Kaminsky, born in 1889, one in Perth Amboy and one in Schenectady. I'm guessing the Schenectady one is right, but I'd also want to double check this one to see if he was in the process of moving or if something else went funny. And I also wouldn't rule out this one in Rensselaer County just because, you know, that part of Prussia did have Polish speakers. And here we look, we have um, two different places. So here's the one in Schenectady, um, and it gives a place in Russia. And here is one that gives a place in Poland. That's the other one, the Perth Amboy. And so this is where you'd want to do things like looking at it's either 1900 or 1910. I'm blanking on which one that lists um, in in the census the birth month and year and see if one of these matches. There's an interesting set of books. These are now online at American Ancestors, and I think it possibly at Ancestry as well now. But it's a series of books that extracted items published in the Boston Pilot newspaper. People almost all from Ireland looking to reconnect with family. And so, for example, um, you know, this one's I'm looking for my McGee's. And Bernard and James McGee, who left Halifax and sailed from New York to California, um, since reportedly have returned to Nova Scotia, please send information about them to their sister in Rhode Island. But you do get some of these that do not only have connections, but they see where somebody was from. So let's take a look at here. We have James Sullivan of Darragee, Drimoleague County Cork, living in Australia. Um, whereas is his nephews are in Portland, Maine. Here's someone from Dublin, um, from Mulgrove near Dromahae. I'm probably butchering that pronunciation. So Lucy Clark being looked for by her sister Eleonora. And so you can see that this series is like 8 thick volumes. Um, so if you've got Irish ancestry, it's worth checking this out because you may be able to find details. I looked at a lot of these, and they really do have details that you won't find anywhere else. Town and county histories. Well, on one hand, you want to be a little skeptical of these because they tended to have very positive biographies of the prominent people in the place that's the history. And in many cases, will give more, especially for the UK, Ireland, more than the county. They will give a town or village name for the immigrant ancestor. I've seen it less for continental Europe, but still, it often does give at least more than the country. It would give, say, a specific place in Poland. Um, we'll mention a group of these 5 or 6 men came here together, and maybe one of the group has a less common name that can be used to find where they were from. And these histories were everywhere in the last quarter of the 19th century. Starting with the US centennial in 1876 through to about 1900, almost any county in the country that was formed by then has a history, from what I can see. But you also get histories. I happened to pick Presbyterian because I was looking, at Irish and Scottish families. But again, many of these will have where somebody came from, either in the old country or this one in Kansas. If the family had been in Virginia for a while and then moved west, it may at least tell you where to look in Virginia. For many of these Presbyterian churches, if they were started before 1800 to 1820, you may well have a group having migrated from Ireland together and settling together with a minister. And it's by following the minister that you figure out where they came from in Ireland. Here's a Presbyterian church record in New York State. And you see here, George Alexander Meyer was born in Glen Cove, New York, marrying Margaret Ross Gowdy, born in Dunbarton, Scotland. And so I've also seen membership transfers where they say where somebody came from, such as, here's records of who's a member of the church. So we have Glasgow, Derry, Ireland, Edinburgh, New York, New York City, and then just I added the little sad face because there's the one just Scotland down here. So this is giving you where they were born or where they were from. It varies. Um, Here's another one in Philadelphia. From what church? And so you have from Pittsburgh, from New Jersey. Here's another one from Dumbarton. Here's one in Glasgow. And then you get remarks about deceased, where they went after this church. And back to alien registrations. As I said last week, I guess it was, if somebody doesn't naturalize, so you can't find a naturalization record, for both World War I and World War II, there are assorted alien registrations. Not every state had them, but if they did, Glasgow, Glasgow. So it's a good place to look. Now, I didn't talk about um, some other things, but for those of you who have Jewish ancestors, synagogue records may be very similar in terms of what they have for um, where somebody comes from. The other thing that happens with synagogues is within communities, especially the larger Jewish communities, you will get benevolent associations, friendly associations are um, direct synagogue, but are where people affiliate where they came from. And in many cases, these will then have a burial ground. Different communities had different traditions and customs. And so you would get, you know, Jews from Romania would have their own organization separate from Jews from Lithuania because they'd have different customs. Um, Sometimes you would get synagogues set up along those lines, especially in places like New York City. But in cities like Toronto, they tend to not be directly synagogue related. It's, you know, very specifically by ethnic group within the Eastern European Jews. So that's the sort of thing to look for. Um, because people wanted to socialize with people who spoke their native language. Um, and so you will find, where I grew up in Buffalo, there was the Italian Roman Catholic Church, the German Roman Catholic Church, the Irish Roman Catholic Church, and they didn't meet for much. They were all part of the same diocese, but there wasn't much cross communication. That may have changed by now. I don't know. But when I was a kid, kid, people I knew went to the Irish Catholic Church and the German Catholic Church, and they wouldn't go to the other one, even though supposedly they had geographic boundaries on the church district. So that's something to keep in mind as well. That if you're not finding records at the church or synagogue closest to where your ancestors of that religious group lived, look and see if there's one a little further away where they spoke your ancestors' native language. It's just like now in cities like Philadelphia, you have Korean Presbyterian churches and Chinese Presbyterian churches, and there's not much mixing because they literally speak different languages. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay, any questions at this point? As I said, this is not comprehensive. It's me trying to say, you know, if I was comprehensive, we'd be here till tomorrow lunchtime. But I just wanted to give you some thoughts about where to look. One last thing before I forget. On the church records, it's not in the volume is the births, marriages, deaths, or the baptisms, beatings, and burials. There's often a separate register of members, or so that's something to keep in mind, that it may not be in the church book with the baptisms, you know, or the marriages. They may have done that. The membership lists and transfers from other congregations that are in a different volume. So, any questions?
Hey, can you see Wayne Smith in his car there driving?
And
Hi, Wayne. Mimi.
Yeah, you hear me?